Hello, AP US History. So the purpose of this video is to go over the development of slavery during the colonial period. So the next major assessment skill for the AP exam that we're going to go over is the Frq prompt. So I wanted to give you a sample of one here. How did the economic, geographic, and social factors encourage the growth of slavery as an important part of the economy of the southern colonies between 1607 and 1775? All right, so when I look at this question, I'm immediately drawn to the three major factors that they list very, very clearly here. I would argue this gives us a really, really good sense of how to organize the essay. You clearly could organize it differently, but the College Board rather, is kind of laying this out on a platter for you. And furthermore, what may be trickier for you to deduce is what kind of historical thinking skill you might want to implement when you're addressing this in your essay. I immediately am drawn towards causation because these three things are leading towards the growth of slavery, right? So that's how I would structure my essay, and I would very clearly refer to the causation historical thinking skill when I was writing. So the way that this presentation is working, more or less, we're going to go over all of the slavery content, but it also is going to sort of serve as a rough outline for how one might go about answering this question. So first, let's talk about all the economic reasons why slavery is becoming more popular. So, as we already discussed in class, before the major proliferation of slavery, which was in the later, well, sort of the mid-1600s, but much more later 1600s, early 1700s, prior to that, indentured servitude tended to be the letter of the law. Partly because they were very easy to come by. There was a huge draw from England, particularly in places that had poor economies or places that were experiencing religious turmoil. There was no scarcity of indentured servants. But as time goes on in Europe, things get a little bit better for people living there, even people of lower socioeconomic classes. For example, the event you might be most familiar with was the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where England establishes a constitutional monarchy, and England writes its Bill of Rights, or John Locke rather defends the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is written by English Parliament, right? And what's important about this for the Americas is that there isn't as much of a drive, particularly from Great Britain, to go to the New World. So you're actually going to start to see colonists from other parts of Europe, particularly Germany and the Netherlands as well, start to migrate in larger numbers to the New World. But anyway, moving back to economic reasons, notice first off that the economy that is developing in the Americas is very much oriented around cash crops. Now, we discussed cash crops in class the other day, but just as a reminder, it's not something that's necessarily edible. It's something that's very high in demand, right? Hence the phrase cash. But as you can see, obviously here, rice is something that's edible, but rice was something that was very hard to get in Europe. The only other sources of rice were from Asia, and it was very difficult to trade with Asia, particularly because it was a difficult land journey. It was blocked off by the Ottoman Empire. So the English increasingly start to turn to the rice market from the Americas because it's much easier of a distance. And furthermore, the colonies are part of England, so they don't have to deal with paying tariffs. Okay, other indigo as well, just in case you're unfamiliar with indigo, it is a dye. A dark blue dye, like for blue jeans, for example. And again, indigo was something that was not found in, I guess, easily tradable locations for Europe. Again, indigo was more popular in the Middle East. There was a lot of it in India. But again, the Ottoman Empire is completely blocking off Europe from trading with these places. Okay, so a few more things to understand about what is encouraging the slave trade itself. Let's go back to another European history term that you might remember, and that is mercantilism, right? And in the broadest sense, it's difficult to compare it to something that exists today economically. But really what it is saying is that there is a limited amount of wealth in the world. And when we say wealth, we mean something that can be measured, like gold or silver, for example, okay? And every country that subscribes to mercantilism believes that it is their job, or their country's job rather, to get as much of this gold and silver, this wealth, as possible for their country, okay? So for example, England and France were rivals in this imperialism game because they fundamentally believed that there was a limited amount of assets that existed in the New World, and they both wanted to have access to them. In a way, it was a very nationalistic thing. It kind of showed the strength of your country, and it was a major reason why the colonies developed so quickly, and why you have all these different European countries trying to get their hands on land in the New World. So anyway, with that said, in order to make the most money for your colony, you want to have the cheapest labor source possible, right? Because labor tends to be the most expensive cost of running a business. So because slavery was legal, and it was something that was also transitioning from the traditional African slave trade, this is something that more and more people are turning to instead of indentured servitude. And we'll talk about that in a moment down here, why indentured servitude instead of slavery. This is cut off, but this just refers to the Royal African Company, rather, which was, again, a joint stock company. We're pretty familiar with those now. And this one was explicitly sponsoring the slave trade. Right, so just as an ID or just as something you can mention, the Royal African Colony is nice to discuss there. And also I want to draw your attention to this diagram here. In the reading, you read about the triangular trade, but this is a good visualization of it here. And it gives us a sense of the economic drive between all three of these regions, the Americas, Europe, as well as Africa. Why are they all engaging in this economic exchange, right? Why is slavery actually encouraged from the African perspective? All right, but let's start with Africa, okay? So if you're in Africa, you're in high demand for manufactured goods because your economy is mainly agricultural, okay? You don't have factories, at least not yet. So you turn to the country that does have manufacturing, or continent rather, the countries within these places that have manufacturing, okay? So what you're getting, what you have a very high demand for from Europe is manufactured goods, things like clothes, manufactured liquors, distilled liquors like rum, right? And things like weapons. Those are the things that you want from Europe if you're African, okay? And what can you trade? Well, one of the, I hate saying this, but one of the, for lack of a better phrase, cheapest commodities that is very valuable for the Europeans is to actually sell slaves, right? And again, slavery already existed in West Africa, albeit in a very different form. So they did this because they got something that they wanted. Then the Middle Passage, which we'll talk about in more detail. So this is the journey from Africa to either the Caribbean, also colonies in South America. We sometimes ignore those. And of course, the English colonies in North America. So basically, this is a very symbiotic relationship that exists between all three of these places. And the last leg of the journey, which I neglected to mention, was basically raw materials that are in high demand in Europe that are coming from the New World, right? So sugar, tobacco, and cotton, to name a few. Indigo I would also put on there, rice, right? But ultimately, the significance of this is that Europe is getting a whole lot of what it wants, right? It's getting all these raw materials that do not naturally come from Europe. Okay, so basically this is giving Europe access to even more goods, things that are not local and things that they can't get with their Eastern markets because, again, they're blocked off geographically and they're blocked off by the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so last thing on this slide, why does slavery start to supplant indentured servitude, which, if you remember, came from the head right system, right? The idea that people who paid for the indentured servant's journey over across the Atlantic would actually get money. They would get a head right, or not money rather, property. So they would get a head right for bringing over these indentured servants. So you might think, why would indentured servitude stop? Why would slavery take its place? Slaves are incredibly expensive. This is true. However, it's a complicated issue. One thing that we always discuss is the idea that slaves, of course, are slaves forever, right? But there's also a racial and a religious factor that we don't discuss as often. The idea that, at least at the beginnings of the African slave trade, the majority of African slaves were not Christian. So this actually helped justify, well, it didn't help justify, but it helped the Europeans justify enslaving these people. They could do it because in their minds, the African slaves were different from what they were, rather. So that's one thing. Also, in addition to religion, as far as racial reasons are concerned, this is obviously the most difficult one to talk about, but it goes more or less along the same lines as Rudyard Kipling's white man's burden justification, and just, I mean, essentially the idea that because these people are a different color, therefore, in their minds, they were inferior, and it was easier for them to enslave them. One also could go into language barriers, sort of the idea that most of the societies that they came across in West Africa were much more agricultural. So because they didn't have major urban centers, that made the Europeans think they were inferior. The thing goes on and on and on. So I can sort of stop with those justifications here. One last thing with this slide, and I know I've spent way too much time on this slide, but I think it's really important for us to really absorb how difficult and violent the Middle Passage was. So again, the Middle Passage is the journey from West Africa to the various colonies in the New World. Well, where does one begin? We already discussed in class just that. And this image as well as this diagram really illustrate it quite well and quite graphically, I might add. The idea that slaves were literally packed onto ships like cargo. Very, very, I mean, they tended to be sort of bolted down into place. They could not move, they could not breathe. They were sleeping right next to one another most of the time, no clothing. No one was coming around and cleaning up after them. You can only imagine what it may have smelled like down there. And furthermore, the most difficult element for modern people to swallow is that these people frequently died. They suffocated. I mean, many things could happen. Suffocated, starved, became ill. These people were not buried with dignity. They were merely thrown overboard. And again, this is actually another thing, going back to this point here, the headright system kind of fell out of favor because with slavery, with a slave term for life, without being too blunt, but being very blunt at the same time, masters could effectively kill their slaves and or accidentally kill them, and they wouldn't experience any punishment, because these people were seen as their property. So I know it's a heavy topic, but it's really important for us to kind of understand the graphic sense of, and just the violence that was associated with the Middle Passage. Okay, we'll very briefly talk about this slide, and then we'll start with a part 2 video. So why was slavery so conducive to the climate, to the environment that existed in the New World? Well, first off, as we already discussed, places like Jamestown were settled partly because, I mean, eventually, or they were successful, at least, because they were located on very, very fertile places, and the climate was conducive to tobacco cultivation in particular. When you get into the rice industry, the more humid it is and the more swampy the conditions are, the better in terms of rice cultivation. Warm, humid climate also means that there's a really long growing season. So it's just much better for agricultural production than it was in farmlands in the north. But problems, of course, as we know, swampland is very conducive to disease. And so malaria tended to proliferate quite a bit in swampy, marshy areas. But then, of course, smallpox was also rampant. Smallpox killed off approximately 90% of the indigenous population. But Europeans and also Africans had much more of an immunity to it. And then, of course, they're connected to the Caribbean slave trade.